come around, please.
Morning. My name is Deborah. I just want to get some information.
Good morning. I am Odessa Duncan, Senior Environmental Officer. How may I assist you today?
Tell me something. They got this man next door by me breaking on this big building, and it's bare asbestos in the roof. I could remember hearing on your TV program that asbestos is dangerous to human health and the environment.
This is correct. The Environmental Protection Act states that any person or facility that is storing, treating, transporting, and or disposing of hazardous waste material must be authorized by the EPA to do so.
Oh, but it's now I'm really hearing about this hazardous waste thing. Tell me something more.
Hazardous waste are waste material with properties that are dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health and the environment, including things like paint, fertilizers, and pesticides, waste oil, and asbestos. These things have the potential to cause cancer, birth defects, kidney failure, and reproductive impairment, with children being at the highest risk. The environmental authorization in this case gives the legal right to transport, store, and dispose of this material in accordance with the EPA Act Chapter 2005 Laws of Guyana. Now, this ensures you and your operation and your process is safe for the environment and human health.
So you mean to tell me that all them leftover Christmas paint that I got on in my kitchen sink, I need authorization from EPA to get rid of it?
No, Miss Deborah. These items, once used for household purposes, does not require environmental authorization from the EPA. However, you should still take necessary steps to ensure that these materials are stored and disposed of in an environmentally safe manner.
Thank you so much for the information. I go in and tell him that he needs an environmental authorization. Thank you.
Welcome to the Environment Matters, a monthly production of the Environmental Protection Agency in Guyana. I'm your hostess, Aretha Ford. As you know, the EPA is tasked with environmental management and biodiversity conservation. And for the last 2 episodes, we've focused on biodiversity in Guyana, the role of EPA in biodiversity conservation and protection, and the link between biodiversity and the tourism sector. For this month's show, we will focus more on environmental management, and more so, we'll be focusing on hazardous materials and waste. Joining me today are officers from the industry and waste management sector of the EPA, Ms. Odessa Duncan, Senior Environmental Officer and Head of that sector, and Vitasha Cambridge, Environmental Officer also in that sector. So before we start our discussion on hazardous materials, Odessa, tell us a bit about the sector that you head. For example, what projects usually come into that sector?
Thank you, Arita, and greetings to all Guyana. So, the industry and waste management sector. Our main objective in that sector is regulating via environmental authorization projects and activities that are related to fuel storage, related to medical and health facility, manufacturing facilities, auto body workshops, facilities that manage hazardous material, and waste management facilities. So our main objective is regulating, as I said, via environmental authorization project or activities in the aforementioned areas. In the regulating of those projects, we need to, one, interact or have interagency collaboration with stakeholders, more so governmental stakeholders. such as Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board, Guyana Energy Agency, Guyana Revenue Authority, and others. We also in the executing our objective, we also meet and we interact with stakeholders who are non-governmental, private stakeholders, because it's important for us to have feedback from these stakeholders as we regulate their facilities. So that's in a nutshell what we do at industry and waste management. Not forgetting, may I add, we also look at the of complaints, because complaints come into the agency with regards to impact these facilities may have on the environment and people health. So one of the important job that we have is to investigate and is to address those complaint matters that come into the agency as it relates to the areas that we manage.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, you would have mentioned stakeholders that the agency works with, and we'll definitely discuss some of those and what we've been doing with those stakeholders a little bit on in the show. I just want to ask one thing. So you mentioned that industry and waste management looks at fuel storage, and there's also a sector in the EPA that deals with fuel storage. That's the gas stations sector. So how does your work in fuel storage differ from that of gas stations?
Okay, so gas station, the sector gas station, their focus is more on the retail side of things. So gas station, you go into the gas station and you know the station there is to provide a service to its customers.
Right.
With regards to fuel storage, so the facility that store in excess of 2,000 liters of fuel, diesel, or maybe diesel or kerosene, or whatever fuel, that facility requires authorization. Now, the fuel storage facility is more like a bulk or a wholesale kind of operation where fuel is stored in this quantity. It could be for the purpose of reselling or for the purpose of a private developer would want to store fuel to run their operations. So they will have their own fuel storage facility. So our focus is more on the facility that store fuel on a wholesale or in a bulk scale.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that for us. All right, so to kickstart our discussion on this month's topic, Vitasha, tell us what exactly are hazardous materials?
Thank you, Rita. Greetings, Guyana. So, a hazardous material, it's basically an item, an agent, a substance that has the potential to cause impacts to humans, animals, the environment. But we know there are many substances that have the ability to do this. So what exactly makes something hazardous? So there are two major characteristics, flammability and corrosivity. Now, flammability means that it has a flash point of less than 140 degrees Celsius, while corrosivity means that it has a pH of less than 2 or greater than 12.5. So those are the two main characteristics that tell you something is hazardous.
All right, so before you go on, you mentioned the term flash point. So just tell us what exactly is the flash point, because some of us might not be scientifically inclined to know what a flash point is when we hear that.
Okay, so the flash point is basically the lowest temperature at which this material will ignite, or as we say, cause a fire. So that's basically what it is.
And when we talk about pH,
we speak about it being either acidic or basic. So something having a pH of less than 2 means that it's going to be very acidic. And above 12.5, it's going to be very alkaline. So that's basically what the pH is.
Okay, great. All right. So now that we know what hazardous materials are, can you give us some examples of hazardous materials?
So some common examples of hazardous materials are paint, which we know it's a very common item, but many persons are not aware that it's actually hazardous. We also have mercury used in the gold industry. We have the acids, the bases used at the school laboratories, pesticides used in agriculture, and among many other items. So those are just a few of the common ones.
All right. And so, how does EPA manage hazardous materials?
So the EPA's role in hazardous material management, it focuses on two main aspects of it. It's transportation and the storage of hazardous materials in country. However, we are taking steps, we're going as far as looking at importation of these chemicals or importation of these materials from the time they come into country, even before they come into country. So, but our main focus is on the transportation and the storage. But we also we're taking steps to deal with its importation.
We are aware that the Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board, their mandate is with regards to the importation of hazardous toxic chemicals and pesticides into Guyana. They have to issue license and approval for it to be imported into Guyana. So EPA role is not to supersede pesticide role. We're not doing that. What we're doing, and we're working with pesticide in this, is to, before it comes into Guyana, we are notified. So we are notified that, okay, this developer intends to bring in this type of chemical into Guyana in this quantity, and it will be stored here. It will be transported from this port to this facility. So being notified will help us to better regulate how it is transported and how it is stored, even on a temporary basis at the port facility. So I just want to make it very clear that the EPA role in this aspect is not really with regards to with the importation. That's pesticide. They will tell you what is allowed in Guyana and what is restricted. All right. So our role is just to make that very clear, and so the general public can understand it. Yeah.
And it's great that we're taking a proactive approach to the management of hazardous materials and working along with the main partner in this regard. So any person who is desirous of importing hazardous materials, of course, has to get clearance from the pesticide board.
That's correct.
As well as for storage, they need an environmental authorization.
That's correct.
And this process is standard across the different sectors of the agency, which begins with the submission of an application along with supporting documents, and then the agency would screen that application to determine whether or not an environmental impact assessment is required or not, and then of course there are various steps that follow before the issuance of a permit. So it's great that we're taking that proactive approach. So Vitasha, I'd like to invite you to tell us about specific requirements when it comes to hazardous materials, because even though we have a standard process, there are specific requirements for various projects. So tell us a bit.
Okay, so if I may add to what Ms. Duncan would have mentioned in terms of the hazardous materials coming into country. So she would have mentioned our collaboration with other agencies in this regard, especially the Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board. So if a developer is desirous of importing hazardous material, they're required to notify firstly the Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Guyana Revenue Authority, the Maritime Administration, along with some other agencies. Now, this notification must be done at least 21 days before importation. So after the 21 days, 14 days before the actual importation of the materials, they must obtain their license from the Pesticide Board. So like Ms. Duncan mentioned, one of their main roles is regulating importation. So they must obtain this license from the Pesticide Board. In addition, they also have to provide these agencies with information. For example, you're desirous of bringing some materials into the country. Which port is this material gonna be heading to? Right?
What?
Yes. What materials are you bringing? What's the quantity? When the materials get into country, how are you removing them from the port? What's the method of transportation, and where are they going? What is the final storage point of these materials? So all of that is information that's required from the developers. So when the materials get into country, like I mentioned, they will have to go to a port facility. Now, what the agency is currently engaged in is regulating these ports in terms of providing guidelines on how they can basically be equipped to store these hazardous materials. So one of the things that we're working on is authorization of these port facilities through the agency and provision of guidance in this area. So some of these requirements for these port facilities will include them having an enclosed area, a separate enclosed area for the storage of these materials. So remember, port facilities have other commodities that are coming. So there's goods, there electric devices and all of that. So we want an area that is separate from all of those. So a separate enclosed area. We want it to be impervious. Simply, it doesn't allow liquids or so to be porous or seep through. It must have fire safety equipment. It must have ventilation, adequate ventilation for these materials. The persons that are working at this specific area, they must be certified. Because remember, you don't want everybody handling these materials. So these persons must be certified in hazardous material management. So, as I mentioned earlier, the main role of the agency is the transportation and the storage of these hazardous materials. So we play a main role or a key factor in getting these materials from the port to the actual storage facility in country. So prior to the movement of those materials from that port facility, you're actually required to submit a transportation matrix or a protocol to the agency for our review, right? So this matrix will basically entail what is it exactly you're moving, or what are the materials being transported. What is the quantity? What is the time that you've set for the movement of these materials? How are you transporting them? Right? The safety data sheets for these materials. Well, what exactly are the characteristics of these materials? Can it be transported via, transported openly? It has to be enclosed. So all of that we need to know. Right? So when approval is granted for this transportation, the next or the other focus would be on the storage of these materials, or the location at which they're going to be stored. Now, just to mention, you would have mentioned earlier the environmental authorization process, right? You would have outlined this process. So, if a developer is desirous of storing hazardous materials at a location, as long as you're storing quantities, or you're desirous of storing quantities of above 1 pound or 0.5 kilograms, that's the basis for authorization at the agency. Any hazardous material or extremely hazardous material being stored above that limit, it requires authorization. So the limit again is 1 pound or 0.5 kilograms, right? So the next thing we have to look at now, where are these materials going? Where will they be stored? Is the facility adequate to store these materials? So upon submission of your application, and we have determined that you actually need authorization for the storage facility, we proceed to do an inspection of the facility. So now the inspection will help us to inform our decision on if this facility is adequate. So is the area enclosed again? Is it the area impervious? Is it impervious? Is there adequate fire safety? Do you have eye wash stations? Are your staff trained in hazardous material management again? Do you have adequate PPE for your staff, personal protective equipment? So that's an important part of this, because like I mentioned earlier, these hazardous materials, they have characteristics of being corrosive or flammable. So personal protective equipment is very important for your employees. So is the facility ventilated? Do you have a first aid kit on site in case of an emergency? Do you maintain a emergency response plan? If a spill happens, how do you manage that spill? Or what are the steps you're going to take to mitigate the effects of that spill? So that's basically the agency's role in terms of regulation of hazardous materials in country.
All right, so there are two things that I want to bring up from the information that you would have provided us so far. And one, it seems like quite a bit of work to be done prior to the importation of that hazardous material and granting of the subsequent permit to have that material brought into country. But I just want persons to remember that the focus of the agency is ensuring that human health and the environment, the natural environment, is protected.
That's
so we
correct.
need to put all these steps in place before we have hazardous materials even coming into the country, and before we even think about storage and transportation and so on. The other thing that you would have mentioned is the importance of having personal protective equipment. Right? This is something that is very often downplayed when you visit various work environments. So it's important to have PPE for your staff. And at this point, we will take a very quick ad break, and we will continue our discussion when we come back. Are you involved in a business or thinking about starting one? Do you know there may be environmental impacts from business activities? According to the Environmental Protection Act of 1996, businesses such as gas stations, rice mills, large-scale agriculture and poultry farms, large-scale mining and forestry operations, hotels, and resorts must be authorized. Persons proposing any of these activities need to submit an application for environmental authorization to the EPA.
Can you come around, please?
Morning. My name is Deborah. I just want to get some information.
Good morning. I am Odessa Duncan, Senior Environmental Officer. How may I assist you today?
Tell me something. They got this man next door by me breaking on this big building, and it's bare asbestos in the roof. I could remember hearing on your TV program that asbestos is dangerous to human health and the environment.
This is correct. The Environmental Protection Act states that any person or facility that is storing, treating, transporting, and or disposing of hazardous waste material must be authorized by the EPA to do so.
Oh, but it's now I'm really hearing about this hazardous waste thing. Tell me something more.
Hazardous waste are waste material with properties that are dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health and the environment, including things like paint, fertilizers, and pesticides, waste oil, and asbestos. These things have the potential to cause cancer, birth defects, kidney failure, and reproductive impairment, with children being at the highest risk. The environmental authorization in this case gives the legal right to transport, store, and dispose of this material in accordance with the EPA Act Chapter 2005 Laws of Guyana. Now, this ensures you and your operation and your process is safe for the environment and human health.
So you mean to tell me that all them leftover Christmas paint that I got on in my kitchen sink, I need authorization from EPA to get rid of it?
No, Miss Deborah. These items, once used for household purposes, does not require environmental authorization from the EPA. However, you should still take necessary steps to ensure that these materials are stored and disposed of in an environmentally safe manner.
Thank you so much for the information. I go in and tell him that he needs an environmental authorization. Thank you.
At the Environmental Protection Agency, we believe that the environment is everybody's business. We can start caring for our planet by becoming more environmentally friendly in our everyday actions. Here's what you can do. Dispose of waste in a garbage bin. Clean our drains, yards, and carpets regularly. Take a reusable shopping bag to the market. Support local butchers and farmers to reduce packaged waste. Plant a kitchen garden, trees and flowers. Compost your organic waste. Conserve water and electricity. Carry a reusable water bottle. These little acts are good for your health and that of the environment. Remember, healthy people work better and achieve more, and together, small actions make a big difference. For further information on how you can help, please contact the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Ganges Street, Sophia, or telephone us at 225-5467. You can also visit our website, epagana.org, or our Facebook and Instagram pages.
Welcome back to our show. For the Environment Matters, we would have been discussing hazardous materials and the role that EPA plays in managing hazardous materials. Now, before we get into some of the stakeholders that we work with, I want to pick up on a point that Vitasha would have made about spills and having a spill response plan. So, Odessa, as head of the sector, I know this would come directly to you. How soon does the developer have to notify the agency in the event that a spill occurs?
Excellent question. So, and this is a condition within the permit. Within 24 hours of an incident, the developer need to notify the EPA. Right? And not only the EPA, but the EPA and other agencies that may have a responsibility to play in addressing that issue.
Right.
So the timeline is within 24 hours. But I would like to even go a bit forward and say immediately, within 5 minutes.
As it occurs.
Exactly. Give the EPA a call and say, listen, this is what happened. Because the faster we are aware, and not only the EPA, but the other agency, the faster we can have contain and clean up. And remember, our role here is to ensure that the environment is not affected. It's affected in the least possible way. We want to mitigate any adverse impact to the environment and to people's health. So we would, I would encourage developers to inform us immediately. But within our permit, you have 24 hours to notify the EPA. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of emergency response plan, because that's a part of the emergency response plan when you notify the EPA. It's in what we realize is the development of the oil and gas sector is seeing a different set of chemicals coming to Guyana, and of course these are some of them are very toxic. So we need to relook at how we manage hazardous material, toxic chemical, how we manage, how it's stored. We need to ensure that there is safeguard. We need to also ensure that we have, or the developers, they need to ensure that they have a spill response plan. Because we don't want a spill, but you have to ensure that you plan for it. That there is a procedure, there is a protocol in place. Should there be a spill? Should there be a small spill, medium spill, large spill? How would you react? What do you do? What would you do? So you need to have a plan for that, and not only need to have a plan, but your employees need to know what this plan is. They need to be trained, they need to understand, they need to take ownership of that plan. So everybody is aware, in the event of a spill, what do? We must all be aware of that. And so it comes back to the second most important thing, or is right up there at the top, is training. And not training only with the manager or the head of the agency. I'm talking about as even the cleaner, the forklift operator. Every staff must be trained in the management of hazardous material, because we're all a part of this process. So they all need to be trained as to how to communicate. Should there be a spill? What to do? Should there be a spill? So training is important, and that is one of the aspects that the EPA is going to be placing a lot of emphasis on with the developer, is to ensure that your employees are trained and they are aware as to what to do should there be a spill. And this is a very important aspect of managing and ensuring that the environment is least impacted from hazardous material.
Yes, indeed. Our job is to control pollution at the agency.
Correct.
And so by having these plans in place, we ensure that the level of pollution is very low. All right, so at the EPA, our motto is the environment is everybody's business. It is not just the job of the government or the EPA to, ensure that we have a clean and healthy environment. And you guys did mention earlier that there are a number of stakeholders that the EPA works with to manage hazardous materials, to manage hazardous waste in Guyana. So before we start talking about waste, let's look at how hazardous materials are managed along with other stakeholders. So Odessa, I'll ask you to identify some of those stakeholders and what their roles are as we collaborate.
All right. Well, I will start off with the most obvious one. We've been talking about this this one from the beginning of the show. One of our important stakeholder, or one of the stakeholders we work very closely with in the management of hazardous material is the Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board, because under their act it has provision also for the management of toxic chemicals and pesticide. And so we work along a lot with PTTCB. Their role is focused on approval and licensing for the importation. So they will indicate if this chemical is allowed to be imported into Guyana. So they, under their mandate, they look at that. They also look at some aspect of transportation and storage with regards to the act. From the EPA focus or point of view, we look at it from an environmental perspective, right? How will transporting this material impact the environment, and storage of impact in the environment? So that's our authorization covers that particular aspect of things. Apart from Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Control Board, we also work with the Guyana Revenue Authority. We all know that the GRA is the police of our ports.
Yes.
So what comes in and so on, they enforce that. So we work very closely with the GRA. GRA said, listen, this person is bringing in this thing, EPA, we need your approval before we allow them to move it off our ports or off the wharf. And so GRA is also very important. We work with MARAT. MARAT has under one of their responsibilities is looking at port facilities and the management of port facilities. Under the Act, I think there was a mandated timeline of 72 hours. Hazardous materials should be removed from port facilities within 72 hours. So we work with MARAT to remind developers and port facilities owners of that most important requirement under MARAT. Many of them have hazardous materials stored at the facility for months at end.
Wow.
Right? And that can cause in its own risk. This is very high risk to the environment.
Is already hazardous, and we did talk about flashpoints and ventilation and all these other things.
So we work with MARAT to ensure that these materials are stored within the 72 hours, and if not, it has adequate facility for storage for extended period. Even for the temporary storage, they still need to have adequate facility, and that needs to be authorized. We work with the Guyana Fire Service. Again, we're talking about hazardous material and flashpoint. So Guyana Fire Research will have some requirements that these developers need to adhere to. So we also need to be informed of these requirements and ensure that it is adhered to. Central housing and planning. Zoning is an issue. We have hazardous materials smack in the middle of residential area. And so before the EPA authorize, before we give our authorization, we want to ensure that you're in the right place. So central housing and planning, zoning approval is a major requirement for especially for storage, for us, for the authorization of facilities, storage facilities for hazardous material. So those are some of the Guyana Police Force, because they're transporting, across the road, along the roads, and even, marked for our river, our waterways, but along roadways. Guyana Police Force is important. We need to ensure that the transporters or the developers are adhering to all the requirements under the Police Act, and so we talk to the police as well. So those are some of the major governmental stakeholders that the EPA and we interact, and we realize that there is more than one agency under their mandate that speak to the management of hazardous material. So we don't want to overlap. We want to encourage synergy. So we actually want to encourage interagency collaboration. And so in encouraging or fostering or strengthening interagency collaboration, the agency early this year would have consult. I don't want to say we would have established a committee because we only had one meeting where we all sat down in a room and we all discussed how are we going to work together to address the management of hazardous material. And so, and the agencies I'm talking about are the ones that I've mentioned. We all sat in a room and we said, listen, what is our issue? How can we tackle it? And so we came up with one of the main things out of that was the notification. We realize that once we are informed and we are notified, well, then all agencies can work together to ensure that this material is managed according to the sound environmental manner, practices, and also best available technologies. So that is how we, and it's really important for us to collaborate. So that's how we collaborate.
Yeah, Odessa, I'm glad you mentioned that, because what we find happening often is when we are going to establish new regulations or codes of practice, guidelines, or what have you, what we often find is that the role of agencies tend to overlap. So I'm glad that EPA and the other agencies would have been proactive in addressing this overlap. And even if it was just one meeting that you would have had so far, it's still a big step in addressing this issue. Right?
Correct.
So we would have talked quite a bit about hazardous materials and, really giving our audience a glimpse into how the EPA functions when it comes to hazardous materials. Now, let's look at the back end of the use of hazardous materials, which you'd say is hazardous waste, because after you use something, whatever is left, you would call it waste, right? But maybe I'm being a bit simplistic in my definition of hazardous waste. So, Odessa, tell us, what is hazardous waste?
All right. Well, the main word here being hazardous, and we've already defined or determined what is considered hazardous. It's basically the characteristic of the item may be flammable, corrosive, explosive, toxic. So those are the characteristics that would identify a material or a waste as hazardous. So the hazardous waste are waste that exhibit those set characteristics. So the same as Vitasha would have mentioned too, waste that are considered flammable, have a flash point of less than 140 degrees. Waste that are acidic, or waste that is alkaline. So it's waste that exhibit hazardous characteristics, right? And I want to zoom in a particular point here to say that a company that manage or use hazardous material in its process, the waste generated from that process may not require authorization. However, apart from that, because authorization is required if you are generating hazardous waste or you're storing hazardous waste in excess of 100 kg.
Okay, so
right?
There is a point at which you will need authorization.
Exactly. And then also your hazardous waste may be something apart from your process, for example, waste oil, which is the most hazardous waste generated right now in Guyana.
That's interesting.
So you may have a facility that is using acid and bases and so on, but the waste from that is not significant as the waste that is generated from another activity, probably your use of fuel to generate, electricity or power. And so you will be generating waste oil in quantities exceeding 100 kg and even more, and that will require authorization. So hazardous waste authorization is specific to meeting that requirement.
Right. So that's very interesting that you mentioned waste oil, because we have quite a number of mechanic shops in the city and in other residential areas. So I dare say that they are the main generators of hazardous waste.
I won't say that
in
they're the
Ghana.
main, but they're definitely contributing.
I stand corrected.
The main generator is those facilities like that use fuel um, as a main part of their operation, like power generation.
Okay.
Power generation for fuel using in the process power generation is made, and so the quantity of waste oil that is generated from that process is significant.
Right.
A facility that is using incinerator or that for example in the mining industry where they generated to power the electricity, and they're using, so they may using incinerator, and they may use a lot of diesel. From that process they're generating a significant quantity of waste. So waste oil is the main hazardous waste, but I wouldn't say that the person who have a workshop, they're the main generators, right?
Yeah.
So we have those persons who use fuel in significant quantities. Then maybe so they're the ones that are the main
Right.
generator of waste
Because
oil.
you did make the point of the quantity
Yeah.
and not necessarily, because I think even if we lump all the mechanic shops together, I don't think they would generate the quantity that is required for an environmental permit. But still, we would like to have all of those persons who operate mechanic
Yeah,
shops dispose of their hazardous waste in a safe, sound manner.
That is true. But they do require authorization, mind you, because the workshop, apart from generation of hazardous waste, they may be using in their process chemical spray painting, and which we know is one of the areas we get many complaints of
That is a
people
very sore issue. It's one of
right?
the frequent complaints that come into the agency.
Exactly. So we do authorize a workshop because of their impact to the environment, apart from the generation of waste, which is also a main thing for those kind of activity. They do generate that.
Just to add to what Ms. Duncan would have said. So apart from the waste oil and well, she said that's the major hazardous waste. So like I mentioned earlier in the show, persons use paint, they use pesticides and all of these.
Yes.
Now the empty containers that are generated from that process, we consider that to be hazardous waste also. Because remember, it's been contaminated with these hazardous materials. So things like paintings, the spray paint cans used in these auto body workshops, persons have the tendency of just disposing of it with regular waste. But it's actually considered to be hazardous waste also, because it has been contaminated with hazardous material. So that's another aspect of that hazardous waste that, the agency is looking at fostering better environmental practices in terms of disposal of this waste.
Yeah.
Right. And the agency does have guidelines for spray painting operations as well.
But Arita, I want to also point out that with the developing oil and gas sector, we're seeing a different kind of hazardous waste being generated by that sector. For example, we now producing oil, right? And that process generates its own particular kind of hazardous waste. For example, drill cuttings, we have produced water, we have the mud and all of that, the sludge, oily sludge and sludge coming off of the oil and gas sector. So it's important for us to also come up with best available technologies, come up with treatment. How will Guyana regulate, or how will we manage this new set of waste that is being generated in our country? And so what we find happening is that we have a lot of developers are coming into Guyana to treat this particular set of waste. So they have treatment facility, treatment systems that are designed to treat waste coming off of the oil and gas sector. You may know of Tiger Rentals, which is one of the facilities that is treating waste from Exxon. So, and there may be others that are coming. But the point I want to make is that what the agency expect of these treatment system is that they now need to understand what kind of waste that their system can accept. So we are working with these facilities now to develop waste acceptance criteria for your treatment systems. And we even going a step forward, because if you for you to understand what kind of waste your treatment your system can accept, the waste itself needs to have a profile or a characteristic. So you need to understand what waste is coming. And so these are important aspect that the EPA is working to develop in-house, and also working with our developers to reach this standard. So hazardous waste is now taking new heights, and the EPA, we have to our learning curve is very steep,
and we
because we
definitely have
have
to
to
stay in the loop and stay on top of
exactly.
things.
So I just wanted to bring that to the forefront as well, in terms of hazardous waste and the requirements that we're expecting at the EPA.
All right. So thank you so much for sharing all of that information. And as we come to the close of our show, again, I want to bring up the importance of stakeholder collaboration. And the EPA, and Guyana by extension, is party to a convention that addresses hazardous waste, and that is the Basel Convention, which deals with the transboundary movement of hazardous waste, or just basically how hazardous waste is transported across borders, right? So we also have international partners that we need to collaborate with. So Odessa, just tell us a little bit about Guyana's involvement, or Guyana's signing on to the Basel Convention, and what is expected of our country as a signatory to that convention.
Excellent. So as you would have mentioned, the Basel Convention speak to the transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal. So the convention outline the control system that hazardous waste is exported to members under that, similar members under the convention for recovery or for disposal. So there's a control system which basically is about notification, communication. The member states saying yes, we have the facility, you can send your waste here, and it's all recorded and it's communicated. So Guyana, being a member to the Basel Convention, will allow us to export hazardous waste that are identified by the convention. That the convention identified the various category of hazardous waste. I won't get into that at this point in time, Arita, because there were a lot. But the convention allow Guyana to export hazardous waste to other members for recovery or for disposal. And our main waste that is being exported under the convention currently is used acid battery, because the exporter needs to find markets or agreements in those countries that will allow them to export their waste to those facilities for, again, disposal or for recovery. So it's an agreement between exporters, but that agreement the whole export must be done according to the control system identifier outlined by the Basel Convention.
All right, so now I know that I can definitely get rid of those car batteries that are in my yard.
Yeah, we do have a few exporters in Guyana. We do have a few, and we encourage persons who are interested in exporting or want to know what to do with my hazardous waste. So I have this quantity of hazardous waste. They can always contact the EPA and ask, can you provide us with any guidance, or do you have, can you identify some of the exporters or some of the facilities in Guyana that can take this kind of waste? Okay. And we will advise you, we provide you with that information, because we do have a few authorized facility that manage hazardous waste for the export. All right. Apart from the control system that details how waste is exported under the convention also look at illegal traffic. So you may have persons illegally bringing in hazardous waste to Guyana, and even wanting to export, because we do not accept waste in Guyana. We don't have the resources, we don't have the facility for such. So you may find that, you know, the illegal trade person may want to come and dump their hazardous waste in Guyana. So the convention speak to how we're dealing with that, and it has, of course, the requirements in working with the GR, with the border control, to ensure that those issues, if it's happening, is addressed, and what are we doing, and they're identified. So that is also an important part of the convention. The convention also provide guidelines for management of hazardous materials. So they help Guyana, or they help all its member parties to with guidelines as to this is how we suggesting hazardous materials should. For example, we have guidelines for electronic waste. You have guidelines for landfill design. You have guidelines for, I think, use as a battery. So the convention also provide guidelines, to its members as to how we can manage hazardous waste according to sound environmental standards. So, and we're very happy to be part of that convention.
Yeah, I'm glad that there is such a convention that is used to manage hazardous waste, because I remember watching quite a few documentaries on the Southeast Asian countries that are now rejecting certain types of waste. So waste management is really a compound issue that, it's not just happening in our backyard, it happens on a global scale, and these have even turned into political issues as well. So it's good to know that there is an instrument in place to look at the global management of hazardous waste, and especially e-waste that you would have talked about. So finally, I would like for you to share with our viewing audience a project that EPA and Guyana by extension is a part of. It's a special project that is funded, I'm correct? That is funded by the Global Environment Facility.
Okay, so under the Basel Convention, there are a number of projects, but the one that is really important and Guyana is very happy to be a part of is the Jeff Island. So it's a project that basically is occurring across the region, the Caribbean region, not only the Caribbean region, but the Pacific region and other regions globally. But it's a regional project which is executed by the Basel Convention Regional Center for the Caribbean, that's in Trinidad, Guyana, and this project will be implemented in 9 Caribbean countries, including Guyana. And the project speaks to the management of chemical and waste. So it's a very timely project, and Guyana is very, very happy to be participating because we will benefit significant from this project. Like you would have mentioned, the project is funded by Jeff, and we have other small agency, or I won't say small because it is not small, but there are also other contributing bodies who are funding this project. For example, FAO, IDB, and so on. But Jeff is the main funder for this project. And like I said, this project will benefit from this project in the sense that it will help us to improve our landfill management. We have one sanitary engineer landfill, Bosch, and while it has come a long way, there is still need for much improvement. So this project will allow us to improve our landfill, and it will allow us to better manage the chemicals that are coming into Guyana and the waste that are generated from these processes. It will help us to like I said, manage according to strong environmentals, and we can benefit from that. And we're working with all the agencies I would have mentioned before, GRA, Ministry of Natural Resources, pesticide. It will allow us to have training, institutional capacity to improve in that. It will allow us to even look at our legislation to improve it where needed, where necessary. And the main thing that this project will allow us as well, and the benefit is synergy. How do we pull all of these companies together to work for the better management of chemical and waste in Guyana, and the project definitely will, the activities will lend to that, and so we will benefit significantly from this project. The project is intended to be a 5-year project. We're looking at implementation from 2021. Because of the COVID, we would have had a bit delay in developing the project document and developing the child project for Guyana, but we are currently in that phase. We're in project preparation phase, and so that is definitely something that Guyana will benefit from significantly, and this is under the Basel Convention. This is just one, but there are many other projects as well.
Okay, great. And I'll assume that the Ministry of Communities is also a
Yes.
major stakeholder in
Yes.
this project, because we
Yes.
are talking about landfills, and with Guyana's development expected to boom in the next coming years with the production of oil. It is expected that there's like this chain reaction where we will have more persons, we will have more waste being produced, and so we will definitely need somewhere to put that waste, and we want to ensure that it is in a controlled environment and it is one that is managed in a sound way.
That's right. And again, let me reiterate, Arita, that it was remiss of me to exclude Ministry of Communities, and I apologize if Ministry of Communities is listening. I want them to know that they are one of our most valued partners in this whole process, and they definitely are involved in this Jeff Island project. They are one of the major stakeholders, as you rightfully said, because they are the body that manage the landfill. So we need the Ministry of Communities participation, and I must say they have been very active with their participation, and they've been with us. As we develop the child project, Ministry of Communities is one of our most important stakeholders. So thank you.
All right, and with that acknowledgement, we would have come to the end of our show. So Odessa and Vitasha, thank you so much for being our guests for this month's episode and for sharing with our public what the EPA has been doing to manage hazardous materials and waste, and to really let people know that we are working on their behalf as we should. Remember to like and follow us on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, on Instagram, we are on YouTube. Our video will be posted on YouTube. And that the ban on single-use plastics is set to take effect in 2021. So get yourselves ready for that. It's not too late to start making those eco-friendly choices that will have us ready for the ban on single-use plastics. And with that, we come to the end of our show. Thank you so much for watching. Are you involved in a business or thinking about starting one? Do you know there may be environmental impacts from business activities? According to the Environmental Protection Act of 1996, businesses such as gas stations, rice mills, large-scale agriculture and poultry farms, large-scale mining and forestry operations, hotels and resorts must be authorized. Persons proposing any of these activities need to submit an application for environmental authorization to the EPA.